Hi, we continue in Acts 7 today as Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin shifts from the question of experiencing God outside of Jerusalem and outside the land to the question of rejecting God's messengers, Moses in particular, but beyond that, and the question of worshiping the works of human hands, pointing toward the temple in Jerusalem, which will lead to Stephen being stoned to death by his opponents. So if you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit of Acts 6 and 7, I encourage you to do so. We go over these questions you see on the right side of the screen and focusing on the themes I was just noting today that we're going to be looking at as we wind toward the end of our section. As I've been noting throughout this unit, as you can look above, and if you haven't been following this, there's no chiastic shape to the larger unit, but there are these paragraphs based on which part of the tradition that Stephen is going over, and then key words in each unit. So as we saw with Abraham, the key words were father and earth, and not exclusive to each unit, but you see the difference. You can see even the color coding. With the Joseph section, it was more around brothers, fathers, and Egypt. Then with Moses, it begins to shift. And we saw a couple of times ago in the 340-year units of the story of Moses, the question of being treated unjustly and Moses being rejected when his brothers did not understand he was trying to give them salvation by finding justice for them. So there was that unit. Then we saw this next unit here where the theme was again around Egypt and the wilderness and God's experience there and returning and turning back to them. And now we finally get to our section here. And we're going to go over these couple of units here. We won't get to Stephen's audience, so I'll scroll up from that. And we see that one of the key words here is hands. We see hands a number of times in the works of hands, and that will be the key point, as well as our fathers. You see 4 times our fathers. Stephen insisting that he's part of the same family of the people he addressed at the beginning as men, brothers, and fathers. So he's really trying to find common ground with them, but of course at one level he knows that he's not. He knows that what he's saying is going to enrage the Sanhedrin. It's amazing they haven't interrupted at this point and already stoned him. But certainly as he turns toward accusing them and not just summarizing the sins, if you will, of the ancestors, we can see why they get aroused. So with no further ado, let's just jump right into our passage here, starting in verse 39 on the left side. So as we see our fathers, the New RSV consistently does the gender neutral, and I undo that simply because I'm trying to highlight the consistency of the male language to which Stephen is trying to address his male interlocutors here. So our fathers were unwilling to obey him. The word thelo is a normal word for want or will, but I highlight it here because it's simply their choice. Stephen's pointing out that they could have listened. It's not like they didn't hear. The word for obey here, both in Greek and the original Hebrew, means both to hear and obey. So they hear, but they're just not willing. It doesn't say why they're not willing. We don't know anything about their motivations. We don't know anything about the Sanhedrin's motivations explicitly, but we can certainly infer them, and we have been seeing that since the Pentecost story when they began to challenge them. So they pushed him aside, recalling verse 27, and as I noted last time, there are a number of elements in this that are summarizing and pointing back to what Stephen has said before, highlighting that he's bringing this to its conclusion. So the fathers pushed aside Moses, and in their hearts they turned back to Egypt. And those are 2 separate things, aren't they? They could have pushed Moses aside and continued on to the promised land. But what they're pushing aside is not only Moses, but the whole question of liberation. Their hearts are still captured by empire, and we certainly know that from the passages, especially in the books of Numbers, where they lament all the great food they had in Egypt, forgetting the slavery. So Stephen is on in that, in the sense that they were imagining going back to Egypt and not listening to Moses or listening to Yahweh and drawing them out. The turning back here will be played ironically by God turning away from them. So as they turned away from God in the promised land and back to Egypt, God turned away from them, as we see. It's not quite a chiasm, but it certainly echoes that there. And then it shifts, saying to Aaron, and this goes to the golden calf. And the golden calf is only mentioned once here. And if you follow my series on the books of Samuel and Kings, you know, in its historical context, the golden calf in Exodus 32, especially as presented as a function of Jeroboam's statues in Bethel and Dan, as reported in 1 Kings, certainly is an argument there about the Jerusalem and Judah-centered worship of Yahweh, as opposed to Jeroboam's so-called sins of Jeroboam by leading people not to worship other gods, but to worship Yahweh in places outside of Jerusalem. Stephen's not interested in getting into all the historical element here. He simply wants to show that they were not listening to Moses, and then when they in the stance of not listening to Moses, they turned to building their own idols, and that's what we'll see here. So saying to Aaron, who is the scapegoat in the story, even though he's Moses' brother, it's amazing he makes it out alive. He's only mentioned once earlier in Luke Acts, and that's in the beginning of Luke, as one of the ancestors of Jesus' family. So make gods for us who will lead the way. The gods plural here is curiously only one time in the New Testament, not too surprisingly, I suppose, given the monotheism of all the texts. Make gods for us who will lead the way for us. Leading the way in the place of Moses, obviously, who is the liberator. The word for lead the way is only in Luke 1:76 for Jesus leading the way. Here it's quoting the Septuagint from Exodus 32. For this Moses, and there's a wonderful irony here, because I was noting last time in Stephen's rhetoric, 4 times he said this Moses to his audience, of highlighting the very Moses who he's being accused of blaspheming is the one who their ancestors ignored and called a ruler and a judge and refused to listen to. So now, in quoting back to Exodus 32, where the group there, not Stephen saying it, but the Israelites there saying, this Moses, saying to Aaron, who led us out, we don't know what happened to him. Of course, it's Aaron's brother, so they don't say either here or in Exodus 32, your brother, but trying to separate Aaron from Moses. And that's what happens in the story, that Aaron cooperates with them, builds the calves, and then shrugs when Moses says what happened. But we don't hear any of that here. So who led us out? This Moses who led us out. So in place of that Moses, God's made out of their hands, as if God's made out of their hands could know the way. We do not know what happened to him. And of course, he's with God, but they're not with God. So that's the story there. And then Stephen continues, just generally summarizing the rest of the story. At that time, they made a calf, as if it came out of nowhere there. And it's a curious thing to just juxtapose it. It's not led here rhetorically to be in connection with the call to Aaron. It doesn't say that Aaron did it, just says they did it. And then they offered a sacrifice to the idol. Idol, the word for idol here is idolo. And curiously, it's not in the Gospels, only one other time in Acts. It's 6 times in Paul, which makes sense when Paul is speaking to a Gentile audience and all of their religious practices he would have seen as idolatry. Here, it's within Israel, but it's also the sense that they were not all faithful, which both Exodus and the prophets that we'll see in a moment testify to. And reveled in the works of their hands. Again, quoting directly from Exodus 32, euphrontathe, it can be a word positively for gladness, but here in the sense of an orgy. The Hebrew word there really is much more of a sense of a sexual orgy, but that's not Stephen's concern here. The concern is this, in the works of their hands, the ergois ton chiron auton. Here is a series of words we saw earlier. The building the building with the work of their hands was one word, and we'll see it again as a single word. Whether it's being made up here or not isn't clear, but it's rare or unique here, as we'll see. So this is the key theme here, the reveling in the works of their hands. And we'll see that's implicitly applying to the temple as well. So, as my note below has, the rest of history is swept over in the rhetoric of God's rejected offer of a salvation-bearing leader or prophet. As Raven notes, Stephen's own words add little of substance to what has already been said by Amos and Isaiah, so that any criticism contained in the speech is neither new nor specifically Christian. And Raven's suggesting that it's superfluous from that regard, but I suggest that's exactly the point. There's nothing specifically Christian in the entire book, because there's nothing about Christianity in the entire book. What there is an argument among the Israelites about which way God is leading them, and Jesus and his followers here take one way, and the temple takes another way, much like was the case in the prophets that Stephen is quoting here. So there's nothing about Christianity anywhere in this, which is my point down below. So God turned away from them, as God does, leaving people to their own devices, including with the monarchy itself, and handed them over. Used ironically here, it doesn't mention God's hand exactly, but we will see God's hand mentioned in just a few verses. To worship the host of heaven. And this wasn't specifically named, and certainly the golden calf is not connected with the host of heaven. This brings us into a whole different unit. And notice what Stephen's doing here. He's moving from the Exodus context here of the golden calf to a much later context, which at the end of verse 43 envisions exile to Babylon and then goes back to the wilderness. So conflating all the time elements here into one continuous movement away from God and toward idolatry. The phrase for host of heaven here, the stratia to orano here, is sometimes used as just simply the sun, the moon, and the stars, positively. Stratia can certainly mean like an army of heaven. The host of Yahweh, as we hear in the Hebrew Bible, can be translated as the army of Yahweh, or the heavenly army. And we certainly know that from the beginning of Luke, when they were there to witness the shepherds, and the birth of, along with the shepherds, to witness the birth of Jesus. Not supposed to worship them, though. They are worshiping along with the humans in that case. As it is written in the book of the prophets. And here we note that what we think of as the minor prophets, or the book of the 12 as it's sometimes presented, is a single book. So the prophets, we have the three major prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and all the others in one scroll. And so we can see, as I put up here, how Stephen's speech is using these prophets. So he's conflating it here into the book of the prophets like it's one voice, but it's from Amos 5:25 and 27, and from Daniel 9:13. Notice the Amos quote is right after 5:24, which is the famous Martin Luther King quote about "let justice roll down like a river, like an ever-flowing stream." So it's in that context. But instead of talking about justice, it talks about this. Did you offer to me slain victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? And it's a very ambiguous phrase, and Cradle notes below three possible ways to interpret it. That it's saying they did not, the rhetorical question is answered no, and that's proper. They didn't offer sacrifices, since sacrifices would have represented idolatry, according to the Amos text. Or another way, you didn't offer sacrifices to me, the emphasis on me, as improper, suggesting instead they're offering sacrifices to the other gods, as we see in verse 43. Or yes, sacrifices are offered, but all sacrifices are idolatry. And note the no in verse 43 that seems to answer the question is not in the Greek, either here in the New Testament or in the Septuagint. It's simply implied by the form of the question that the answer is no, but the answer isn't necessarily no, and the question is left unanswered. So it could be any of those things. The word for victims here, spagia, is only here in the New Testament, and it's not in the prophetic text other than Amos. So it's a direct quote from Amos there. And then we see the alternative. And the interesting element of the alternative sets up two competing tents. I'll scroll down so we can see that in light of the larger image. The tent of Moloch and the tent of witness, or the tent of testimony. So the accusation is they took the tent of Moloch, who's the chief god of the Babylonians, the one who justifies the king of Babylon being a representative of Moloch himself, or Marduk in that form, and the star of your god Rephan. And there's all kinds of translation issues here, as my note below has from Fitzmyer. The Hebrew, original Hebrew in Amos translates, Kaiwan, your star god. Either way, scholars agree that whether it's under the name Rephan from whatever form, or Kaiwan, it's almost certainly referring to Saturn, which would be an important god to the Romans, and hence we know it as the seventh day of the week, Saturday. But it wouldn't have been so much of the Israelites in the ancient world. That wasn't one of the big idols. But either way, it represents idolatry. Why Stephen goes to this particular quote out of all the possible quotes of idolatry isn't clear, but maybe it's because it's connecting the Exodus to the exile, highlighting that idolatry leads to either being in Egypt or being in Babylon, either way. So I will remove you, metoikio here, echoing 7:4 of Abraham being called out of Babylonia, with reverse effect there, to beyond Babylon. The Amos passage in the Septuagint is beyond Damascus, which certainly applies to the Assyrian exile of the northern kingdom of Israel, not the southern kingdom of Judah. But since he's talking to the Sanhedrin, who would already have inherited the theology that Israel went into exile because of the sin of Jeroboam, in other words, for not worshiping in Jerusalem, that wouldn't be relevant to them. What's relevant to them is it's connecting with their own experience of exile in Babylon. But without giving them a moment to comment on that, he goes back now, and we'll go back to the shape of our passage here to see that, back to the wilderness. So our ancestors had the tent of testimony, the Mikadesh here in Exodus 25:8, but in the very next verse it's the Mishkan, for the first time of 139 times there. And I want to highlight that because in my book, Come Out My People, I highlight that the Exodus story raises up the Mishkan as an alternative to the temple. If we read them historically, it seems like the Mishkan is sort of the preparation for the temple, and that's how the theology in the books of Kings presents it as well. We couldn't have had a temple because we were on the move, but once we settled, of course we built a building. But as I've suggested, the Exodus story is written precisely as an alternative to the monarchy story that justifies Solomon and the succession of his son Rehoboam, to say that God's intention was that they stayed in the wilderness, that they were supposed to be a migratory nomadic people trusting in the Creator. So the Mishkan, which has a long description in Exodus, is there precisely as the one that God told them to make, as opposed to the one that they wanted to make to justify the monarchy, which a temple almost always does in an imperial context. So that's some of the cultural context here. The Sanhedrin certainly know some of that. Would Luke's audience? It's not clear. But perhaps readers of the Bible today don't, without my giving that little help. So hopefully that gives you some context there. So they had the tent of witness in the wilderness, as God directed when he spoke to Moses. Notice what's being described here. It will be a work of human hands, but according to a divine pattern. The directive when he spoke to Moses is not in the Greek here, so we see it just simply continues here, as you see, ordering him to make it. So the ordering him is there. The word diatasso is not in the Pentateuch in the Septuagint. It's only here in Acts and a couple more times in Acts. According to the pattern, and this is tupon or type, which matches images here, as you can see from my note there. But one of the issues about that is that it provides what I've called a Platonic adjacent way of thought here. If you see my note from here, we see the word is only one other time in the Gospels, in John 20:25. We can look at that briefly here, where we see that it's described as the mark here, the type of the nails in his hands. So it's a different meaning there, not about a textual echo as we see here. So the images in the sense of the one that is revealed to Moses directly from God to the one that they actually build in the situation. But because it's following the divine pattern, it's understood as not being made according to human hands. But it's Platonic adjacent because this seems a lot like the Platonic idea of the forms, that the forms are up there in the sky, in the biblical sense, on the other side of the veil, and then all the elements of that, like tableness, as the pure form, are found in actual tables. But this is unique. This isn't the form of tables in the generic sense, but of a very particular thing, the Mishkan. And it has one form, and it's built once, and it cannot be made again. So no further on the description, even though it takes many chapters in Exodus. Our fathers brought it into where isn't clear, presumably into the promised land, but this doesn't describe that exactly. It doesn't say into the land, even though, as we've been highlighting, the land has been a theme throughout this whole chapter, but mostly the other land, not the land of Canaan, but the lands of Mesopotamia, of Midian, of Egypt, etc. So, all right, with Joshua, when they dispossessed the nations, or literally in the taking of the nations, which is a little propagandistic because according to Joshua and Judges, they didn't, which is why they needed a king, is that they failed to do that. But it's described here as God drove out. Not that they did it, not that there were the ongoing wars that we see in Joshua and Judges, but somehow it's just one mighty stroke from God, just in the same way that God stopped the Egyptians from following them into the desert. But in the narrative in Joshua and Judges, it's not nearly as simple as that. The word for drove out here, exosin, is expelled, or literally threw out, not elsewhere in the New Testament, as my note below has in the telling the indigenous peoples remain. And then it jumps completely from Joshua to David. The entire monarchy is irrelevant here. This is not a critique of monarchy. It's going to be a critique of Jerusalem and the temple. Of course, there is no monarchy in Jerusalem other than the monarchy of Rome, and so that's not the direct issue. It was there is not in the Greek, and that's key, because it's very misleading of where the there is until the time of David. So that's not there to distract us. It's literally when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before enters until the time of David, which is what you see here on the right side over here, or literally until the days of David, who found favor with God. And notice how this follows much more a Chronicles perspective, not David the warrior, no mention of Bathsheba, not even David the psalmist, but simply the David who's pointing toward the house for Yahweh. But not described as a house for Yahweh, but a dwelling place for the house of Jacob, or as different manuscripts suggest, the God of Jacob. As my note below has, it could be oiko or theo. Witherington suggests house is the stronger reading because it's unlikely to be changed from God to house, but Johnson and Keener side with God because really house of Jacob makes no sense here. It's plainly the question of a house for God, not a house for the people, and there is no house for Jacob in the land. The land is their house, so to speak. So the issue of dwelling place here is skenoma here, only here in Luke Acts, but it's a form of tent. It's a form related to the verb for tent, so whether it's the tent of Moloch or the tent of testimony, now a tent for the God of Jacob. Nothing more about David here, and nothing more about why David isn't the one. As Raven notes below, Stephen's criticism of the temple is not against its cult, but that it was built because of Solomon's fundamental misunderstanding of the house of David as a building, which doesn't rise up here. But what he's pointing to is that in the story in the books of Samuel, especially in 1st and 2nd Samuel 7, where the promise of a dynasty to David through Nathan comes, the question of the house of David or the house of Yahweh is at issue, and the wordplay there. But that wordplay doesn't come up immediately here in Acts. Solomon is mentioned here the only time in Acts, but for readers of Luke, that should recall this scene here. Consider the lilies, how they grow, they neither toil nor spin. I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. So if Solomon is dissed there as being not greater in revealing God's glory than a mere flower that's thrown away tomorrow, it's certainly undermining for listeners who remember that Solomon's authority in building a house for Yahweh, which is immediately undermined not via Solomon, but via Isaiah 66, as we see here. As Keener notes, the danger of idolatry in the wilderness, signaled by Amos, has been transferred to the Jerusalem temple here. And this is where we get to the Isaiah 61. Yet the Most High, a Lucan term here, only 2 other times elsewhere in the New Testament, does not dwell in houses made with human hands. And that's a stronger form that is necessary. It could have said does not only dwell, but it's more absolute, does not dwell, as if God is not in and has never been in the Jerusalem temple, neither the first one or the second one. All he really needs to say is not exclusively to justify why God is with them and why they experience the Holy Spirit in the upper room, etc., but he makes the more absolute statement here. Does not dwell on katoikeo here, not the word for tenting here, but the word for being a dweller in a place, in houses made with human hands. And here the word is the single word I was referring to earlier, literally handcrafted. And we'll see it in Athens, and we'll see it also in the parallel passage in Ephesus, which is very parallel, where the economic issue is revealed behind the question of worshiping Artemis in that case, not Yahweh. And note here that it's refuting the claim for Solomon's temple at 1 Kings 8, etc., which as not made with human hands, as the prophet says here, quoting Isaiah 66. As Walton notes, the prophecy is being quoted thus not to reject the temple per se, but to critique the people by underlining Stephen's claim that the Creator God is not limited to such places. But I think Walton is missing the point that I was just making, that Stephen's claim in verse 48 is absolute. Maybe Walton suggests it might be less absolute, not limited to such places, but that's simply not what it says here. Instead it says, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me? That the house is unnecessary altogether. The word for footstool here, hupopodion, we saw earlier, it's used another time in a different sense of footstool, of putting your enemies as a footstool. So earth and enemies are both in the same place under the Creator's feet. What kind of house will you build for me is an interesting question. Of course, it's a rhetorical one. The issue isn't what kind of house. The fact that it's handmade already makes it wrong. The present tense here underscores what we heard in verse 38 of Moses giving them living oracles. And here they are living in the present tense. Or what is the place of my rest, still in the present tense. Did not my hand make all these things? And of course, that's the great contrast between the Creator's hand and the human hand. It's often what I've said in my Genesis series, or when I've taught it in churches or in a college environment, that if we read Genesis, original sin has nothing to do with sex. Original sin has to do with God saying, I made the world good and I gave it to you as a gift. And humans look at it and say, but we can make it better. So we'll continue in Stephen's condemnation of the stiff-necked, uncircumcised, and heart and ears people next time. See you then. Bye-bye.